If you've ever applied for a job, you definitely know the feeling. You send in your resume, you survive the interviews, maybe you even take a test, and then you wait. It's a process that hits almost all of us at some point, and we all just hope it's a fair shake. But what does fair actually mean when it comes to hiring? And how in the world do we even measure it? Well, today, we're prying open the official rulebook to find out.
It's the kind of question that can keep you up at night, right? You replay every answer, every handshake, and you wonder, were you judged on your actual ability to do the job, or was something else going on? Was that test a real measure of your skills? Was the passing score just picked out of a hat? Was the whole system tilted somehow? These aren't just late-night worries. They are some of the biggest scientific and legal questions in the entire world of work.
So to try and bring some order to all this chaos, the US government created an official rulebook way back in 1978. The goal was pretty simple: create one set of principles to stop discrimination in hiring, promotions, and testing, and to be the final word on what makes the whole process fair.
But science and society don't stand still. What seemed like a solid plan in 1978 has been picked apart by psychologists for decades. And in the process, they found some fascinating puzzles where the original rulebook was, well, incomplete or even flat out wrong. Today, we're going to investigate the 4 most critical updates that science says we desperately need.
All right, here's our game plan. We'll look into a flawed rule of thumb, the tricky business of measuring success, the whole debate over setting passing scores, and then the biggest question of all: how do we know if a test is actually fair? Let's dive right in.
So our first puzzle starts with this big idea called adverse impact. Basically, it's what happens when a hiring practice, even one that seems totally neutral on the surface, ends up screening out a whole lot more people from one particular group. And to spot this, the original 1978 rulebook gave employers a pretty simple tool. It's called the 4/5 rule, and it works like this. Let's say a company hires 10% of its male applicants. That means it has to hire at least 8% of its female applicants, since 8 is 4/5 of 10. If that rate drops below the 80% mark, it's a red flag. For a really long time, this simple rule was the standard.
But here's the kicker. Even back in 1978, the very same year the guidelines came out, a legal scholar named E.W. Shobin called it ill-conceived. Why? Because this simple rule of thumb has a massive blind spot.
The rule's biggest blind spot is sample size. See, it's just a ratio, so it treats a tiny 10-person company the exact same way it treats a 10,000-person giant. And with small groups, your results can get totally skewed just by random chance. A much smarter tool is statistical significance testing. It takes sample size into account by asking a better question. Is the difference in hiring rates we're seeing real, or could it just be random luck? Without that check, the 4/5 rule can miss real problems or, just set off false alarms.
Okay, so we've seen that the very first step, just checking for problems, is a lot more complicated than it looks. But that leads us to an even deeper puzzle. Let's say we have a test. How do we know if it's a good test? Well, it needs to predict who's going to be a successful employee. But that just raises the next question. What is a successful employee anyway?
The first challenge is something researchers call criterion dynamism. All that really means is that an employee's performance isn't set in stone. You learn, you grow, you have good weeks and bad weeks. Research actually shows that how people rank compared to their coworkers changes a lot over time. This makes trying to predict long-term success from a single test a bit like trying to hit a moving target.
And this uncovers another layer of complexity. A hiring test, it measures your maximum performance, what you can do when you're really trying your best. But a job, that requires your typical performance, what you will do day in and day out. And here's the really surprising part. The research shows these two things are only slightly correlated. We're often testing for one thing, but the job actually demands something else entirely. Finally, being good at your job isn't just one thing. Researchers have broken it down into at least 2 major categories. On one side, you've got task performance. That's your core duties. Can you write the code? Can you make the sale? But on the other side is contextual performance. This is all about being a good citizen at work. Do you help your colleagues out? Do you support the company's goals? A truly great employee is good at both, so a good hiring system really needs to think about both. Okay, on to our third puzzle. Imagine we've designed a test that we think does a good job of predicting performance. Now comes one of the toughest steps, setting the passing score. If you get this wrong, you could unfairly screen out amazing candidates or let people who aren't qualified slip through.
So how is that line actually drawn in the sand?
Well, a common way to do it is with something called the Angoff method. It's a really formal, structured process. First, you get a panel of experts who know the job inside and out. Then, they all have to agree on what a minimally competent person looks like. After that, they go through the test question by question and estimate the odds that this person would get it right. Finally, they average all those ratings together to set the final passing score.
Now, this idea of minimum isn't just a suggestion, it's a legal standard. A huge landmark court case established a key rule. If a cutoff score is causing problems, an employer has to prove that it reflects the minimum qualifications necessary for that job. You can't just set the bar arbitrarily high if it's going to unfairly exclude qualified people.
And that brings us to our fourth and final puzzle, the one that's really at the heart of this entire discussion. We've talked about checking for unequal outcomes, measuring performance, and setting the bar. But what if the test itself, the very tool we're using, is fundamentally unfair for different groups of people?
The official definition of fairness is a little technical, but stick with me. A test is considered unfair if it systematically underpredicts the job performance of a particular group. In other words, if two people from different groups get the exact same test score, they should perform about the same on the job. If one group consistently does better on the job than their test scores would suggest, then the test itself is biased against them.
So, how do you find this kind of unfairness? We have statistical methods, but how well they work depends on something called statistical power. The best way to think about it is like a low-resolution camera. A blurry photo might look fine, but a high-res camera would show you a serious problem. Our statistical fairness detector can be too weak, especially when we're dealing with small sample sizes or when we only have data on the people who actually got hired.
And this is maybe the most sobering takeaway of all. An organization could run the numbers, do all the analysis, and conclude that their test is fair. But that conclusion might be completely wrong. The test could, in reality, be systematically biased against a group of people, but their statistical tools were just not powerful enough to see the problem. They've mistaken a blurry picture for a clean bill of health.
So after navigating these four pretty big puzzles, what have we learned? It's clear that the 1978 Rulebook needs some serious upgrades based on decades of research. Let's pull it all together and build a modern playbook for fair hiring.
All right, here are the key takeaways. First, we need to move past the simple 4/5 rule and use stronger statistical tests that actually account for sample size. Second, we have to measure what really matters by defining job success broadly, including stuff like task and contextual performance, and remember that it's a moving target. Third, any cutoff score has to be set carefully, making sure it's legally defensible and truly reflects the minimum skills needed. And finally, we absolutely have to be aware of the problem of low statistical power, so we don't accidentally give an unfair test a passing grade.
When you boil it all down, what this all really points to is a shift in mindset. Achieving real fairness in hiring isn't about ticking boxes on a checklist that was written half a century ago. It's a dynamic process. It's about being humble enough to recognize the puzzles and the loopholes in our systems, and then being committed to constantly updating our practices with the very best science we have. And all of this leaves us with one final big question to chew on. The science has advanced so much since 1978. We have better tools, a much clearer picture of what fairness really is. So the next time you encounter a hiring process, ask yourself, is this company running on the latest science, or is it still operating on rules from half a century ago?